Hey everyone, this is Zephyr, and welcome to the Bailiwiki channel, where we teach everyday DMs how to create truly amazing experiences for their players by combining art and technology. We also make modular systems and scenes that you can use without any setup. And some of our latest maps are going to be the backdrop for today's installment of Automating Foundry with Monk's Active Tile Triggers, where today we cover Monk's Active Tile Triggers 101. If you've seen our maps or have watched many of our other videos on the channel, then you probably know that we love Monk's Active Tile Triggers. Whether that's for creating interactive elements, hot swappable art assets, teleportation, or even entire control suites to radically transform maps with the press of a button, or tile as it were. Today, we wanted to break down some of the basics because Monk's Active Tile Triggers is an amazing module that has an incredible amount of depth, and it's really easy to get lost in or tripped up by the basics. So we're going to take today to slow it down a little bit and just drill down everything you need to know about Monk's Active Tile Triggers in terms of the setup, extra interfaces added to a tile, and the gist of how to configure and set up actions, as well as leave you with a few helpful resources towards the end for furthering your learning. Now, with all of that said, let's go ahead and dive into the basics of Monk's Active Tile Triggers. Our classroom today is going to be this Dwarven Fortress Ruins entrance from our latest release that has some Monk's Active Tile Triggers already set up on the scene. For example, we can left click on these piles of wood to change them into fires, and we can right click to change the look of the braziers that are actually holding the fires without changing the image of the wood and fire itself. I've also added a few other pieces for understanding these concepts and helping us along. Before we dive into all of the different settings and how things are changed on a tile, I want to cover some different topics and concepts to understand before we really start getting into the nitty-gritty detail. Note that for today's video, we're going to assume that we have Tagger installed as well. We highly recommend using this module whenever you're using Monk's Active Tile Triggers, and we'll explain that a little bit more in depth as we go along as well. The big things that we're going to discuss are going to be tokens, which are just any old token that's running around. Users, which are the people who are controlling the tokens. Tiles, which are the things that we actually tie our Monk's Active Tile Triggers to. And then finally, triggers. Triggers are what we're going to call the whole set of data that is involved whenever a Monk's Active Tile Trigger goes off and begins to do its thing. The triggers are comprised of things such as events, and those events determine what can actually prompt a trigger to begin. Then the trigger also includes some different information, such as that token and the user that was controlling the token that triggered the tile that is being triggered itself, and then any extra information that is modified by our different settings that we have on this tile, including things that might stop a trigger from fully beginning. You can use any image that you would like for Monk's Active Tile Triggers, unless you're using some specific settings that we'll cover here in a moment. This particular image is from the Bailiwiki Maps Towns module, and there are a variety of different great images for use with Active Tile Triggers, and we also have some of those included in the free Maps pack if you want to take a look at those. Diving into the basics, there are two main pieces that you'll notice when you go to the basic section for your tile. At the bottom here, we have the tagger area, and this is where we add in tags for tagger. And then we have this little floppy disk icon that allows us to save this as a template. And so we can just have example here and hit yes, and then this will open up this tiles directory where we have all of our tile templates, and we can drag it out, or we can click on it to rename it, and then we have made a complete perfect copy of that tile from our template. This can be useful for storing tiles that you're going to use frequently, or having kind of work in progress save points as you go if you're making something really complicated. To access the tile templates directory from outside of where you go to save it, you can go into your tile tools, and then this image that looks like two folders coming off of branches is the tile templates button. When you click on it, it'll open up this directory where you can, again, drag these out or click on them to rename them. Returning to our tile, The other main section that we'll notice is the triggers up at the top. When you go to triggers, this is your main port of call for all things Monk's active tile triggers. The triggers tab has 3 sub-tabs. Setup, which is kind of the basics of what's going on with your tile. Actions, which are the things your tile will actually do. And images, which you can reference using Monk's active tile triggers to swap the different images of the tile around. If we look at the fire here, you can see that there are 2 separate images listed here, and in the actions, we're switching the tile around. We'll cover that a little bit more in a bit. So back on our example tile here, we'll go through the setup section. The first thing to notice is the active toggle. And this is really important. It's incredibly easy to miss that your tile is not actually active. So if you're testing things and you're not understanding why your tile isn't working, make sure that it's listed as active. You can make it active on the sheet. You can also right-click on your tile, and this image of a person with the kind of glowing aura around them is whether it is active or not. So if I close out my tile configuration and use that toggle, you'll notice that the active flag is no longer present. If I update the tile, then we'll see that it now has that orange glow around it again. Next, we have history. This is needed for some actions in order to function, but basically it allows the tile to store some additional information. It can also be really helpful when you are testing things. If you tick this on, then when you have view history, you'll be able to see a readout of all of the times tokens have triggered the tile and how exactly. So if I update the tile and I use one of my tokens here to trigger the tile, and we look at the history, we can see the token's name, when it was triggered, how it was triggered if you have multiple trigger methods, and who triggered it. You can delete individual entries by clicking on delete item, or you can reset the history entirely. The view variables button opens up a table that will give you all information about variables stored on the tile. Variables are a really powerful tool for Monk's active tile triggers, but it's going to be outside the scope of this video where we're just going over the basics. Note that if you're using variables on your tile, you do not have to have history turned on in order to use them. Moving on from history, the next section is restricted tokens. This is going to determine what tokens can trigger a tile. The default is allow all tokens, which, as the name might suggest, any token can trigger it. You can also restrict this to only player tokens and only GM tokens. Now, what determines a player token versus a GM token is not dependent upon the actor type associated with that token. For example, here I have 2 actors here. We have Gomer and we have Ventress, and both are designated as player characters in terms of their actor type. And if we expand this, we'll notice that if we configure the ownership, Gomer is not owned by any players, while Ventress is owned by all players. And that is going to be the key defining difference between a player token and a GM token. A player token is any token that is owned by any player. If a player has the ownership permission, then they are going to be classified as a player token versus a GM token. So if we restrict this to only player tokens, then that means Gomer should not trigger this, while Ventress will. And then conversely, if we set this to only GM tokens, then Ventress should not trigger this, and Gomer should. This is useful if you are designing traps that are only going to affect your players, and also useful if you have certain things like when a monster reaches a certain point, then something happens in the rest of your map, or something like that. Next, we have controlled by. Anyone, of course, means anyone, and then you can also restrict it to player only and GM only. Typically speaking, you're going to want to leave this on either anyone or on GM only. Reason being is that if you have it set to just player only, then it's going to be very difficult for you to test it properly as a GM without having to have separate windows open or separate instances of Foundry to be able to test it. The when section is going to determine what events can actually cause a trigger to occur for a tile. There's a lot to go over here, so we're going to discuss these in a little bit more detail when we finish breaking down the rest of the setup section, as there are a lot of pieces here. The rest of these settings are going to further modify what's going on with the triggering of your tiles. So the first option is allow when paused, and that's going to allow these triggers to be activated whenever the game is paused. So we can see we have the pause logo down at the bottom, and if you have the allow when pause, then this will work for anyone who is normally able to trigger the tile, regardless of whether the game is paused or not. Now, as a GM, a lot of things are still going to trigger for you, even if the game is paused, but we recommend that you turn this on when you're testing and maybe turn it off again if you don't want it to be triggered outside of normal game time. Next, we have trigger using image instead of border, and I've actually brought in a separate tile to demonstrate that here. This is where the image that you're using for Monk's active tile triggers actually matters. As you can see here, we have the lever, and Monk's active tile triggers is normally going to care about the bounding box, which you can see in orange here. This applies to any kind of shape that you have on your artwork. It's going to create a square around that tile, and that's how Foundry works in general for selecting the tile that you have. Is going to be a square around the object, and it's going to be the same width and height as the maximum extent in any of those dimensions, or as defined by the image itself. So when you have this set to click here and you're not using that trigger using image instead of border, then whenever we click inside of this bounding box with our token tools, then we're going to have the lever has been triggered. Then if we go ahead and switch to trigger using image instead of border, then clicking inside the bounding box gives us nothing, but if we click on the actual image itself where there are opaque pixels, then it will trigger the lever. This is really useful for certain traps, or if you have really precise clicking like that modular mansion kind of mini-map control that we had before, because those bounding boxes would be overlapping significantly if we were relying just on the bounding boxes. But this trigger using image instead of border really saves us there. One thing to note with images like this one that have a actual physical border added to them in the artwork is that they don't quite play nicely with the trigger using image instead of border. If you turn that on and we add the click, we update the tile, we'll notice that this is going to still count clicking in this white space. And that's because this is an enclosed area, and so it thinks everything inside of this enclosed area is clickable or should be clickable. So you can't quite create holes within it. However, this is still very useful for a lot of different shapes. Next up, we have hover over pointer. So you have this turned on, then whenever you are in your token tools, hovering over the tile will give you this pointer image, as opposed to the normal just mouse image. Next, we have token must have sight to trigger. This is going to be on by default. This doesn't really matter if you are using things like enter or movement for triggering this, but if you have things like a click, then that means the token that is triggering it needs to be able to actually see the object. So this prevents your players from just clicking randomly in the fog of a map and happening to click on a tile and triggering it. And so they actually have to have vision of it. Next, we have some limitations on how the tile can be triggered. First, we have once per token, and this is going to require that we have the history turned on, and that's going to prevent tokens from triggering the tile again if they have already triggered it once. So if we look at our history, we have the different instances of Gomer and Ventress triggering the tile here. If we reset the history, then we can test this really quickly, and if Ventress steps in there, it's triggered, but he cannot trigger it again. And same thing with Gomer. So if you have certain things like you only want to allow a token to have one attempt at something that you are automating with Monk's active tile triggers, then this is how you can do that. It also prevents some double jeopardy from springing a trap twice, etc. Next, we have the minimum required to trigger, and this requires the tile to have been triggered a certain number of times before we'll actually start going through the actions. So if we set this to 2 and update the tile, we'll notice that when Ventress steps onto the tile, nothing happens. But if he steps out and steps back in again, then the tile has been triggered and it's actually going through the actions. We can corroborate this by looking at our history. We can see that the first time we entered, and then we entered again, and then we actually had that pop up. But now that's been triggered twice, it's not about each individual token. Instead, it's the total number of triggers that have happened to the tile. This can be useful for certain applications where maybe you want to surprise the party by, say, the third person walking over the tile causes something to happen, etc. Then we have a cooldown section, and cooldown does not require our history to be active. And this simply puts a limitation on how frequently you can trigger this tile. So if we set this to 5 seconds, we can very quickly step out and step back in. And we'll notice that it did not trigger within that time frame, but now that we've waited 5 seconds, the tile has been triggered, and we are out of the cooldown period. Useful for preventing spam of certain things. And then finally, we have a chance to trigger, which we can set to a pretty low amount here, or we can set to, say, a 50-50, and that's just going to make it so that the tile does not always trigger. All right, now that we've covered our setup area in general, let's go ahead and return to the when section. And these are going to be those events that I mentioned earlier as being a part of your trigger. So when is going to be the beginning part of how a tile can be triggered. A tile can be triggered in a variety of ways and could even be triggered in multiple ways, as we kind of already saw earlier. If you click on this drop-down menu, you can see that you have a variety of options. The most common ones that you're going to work with are enter, exit, movement, perhaps stop within tile, and things like the click variations such as click, right-click, double-click, and double right-click. There are a lot of other options in here, and another one that might be more topical for you is manual activation. So you can have manually activate here. However, it's worth noting that manual activation can be used whether that is actually listed as a trigger method or not. As we said earlier, you can have multiple of these trigger methods. So whenever you select something from this drop down, then it will add a kind of button here, and you can click on the X's in the buttons in order to remove them. So enter and exit are pretty self-explanatory. It's whenever a token actually enters or exits the tile. So that is when the bounding box of the token crosses the plane of the bounding box of the tile. So as we've been seeing with enter, as soon as Venture starts to cross into this tile, we have the dialog showing up for the tile has been triggered. And then as soon as we go to leave, then it will also trigger. For movement, it's a little bit different. Movement only counts once you are beginning within the tile. So if we have movement set up, then when Ventures enters, nothing is going to trigger, but then the movement is going to count for any time he moves while he begins his movement inside of the tile. So if we move around inside of the tile, it's going to trigger it, and we step out, it will also trigger it. So if we look at our history, we can see movement 3 times. You'll also note that things can trigger multiple times at once. So if we have the exit here selected as well, then when Venturous steps in, we have not triggered the tile yet. Confirm that by looking at our history, and we can reset that. Then when we step out, you can notice that this dialog is a little bit darker. And if I hit OK, there's another one there as well. And we can see that if we open up the tile and look at the history, we have movement and exit happening at the same time because they were triggered by the same action here, or the same event, because the movement that caused Venturous to leave the tile was the same as the movement that began within the tile. So that's an important thing to note here, is that with all of the events that are beginning your triggers, they can happen simultaneously. So keep that in mind when you're designing tiles, and make sure that you are not double dipping on these activations unless it's very intentional. Moving on from our more movement-based triggers, if we take a look at the clicks that we've already seen, we have click selected for our activation. We simply left click anywhere within the tile's bounding box, and the tile has been triggered. One thing to note is if you look at the view history, this has no tokens selected, and then it's been triggered here. So there is no token associated with the trigger that began this process here. So the event of clicking is only registering the user and how it's been registered and when it's been registered. It is completely separate and independent from any tokens. Now, if you wanted to have a token associated with this, then you need to have a token selected. And then when we click on this and open up the tile, we can see we have Venturous here as our token. This is important if you have different logic statements, for example, requiring someone to be within a certain distance of the tile in order to trigger it, then someone would need to have their token actually selected when they do that. It's typically not going to be an issue whenever it is a player, as most players have their tokens selected for most of gameplay. But in case that is a common thing that happens at your table or when you're testing, and you have some kind of filter or logic there to make sure that someone has to be meeting certain conditions when they click on it, then make sure that the tokens are selected properly. Then the last one we're going to cover today is manual activation. And that can be done by right-clicking on the tile and clicking on this power button here. And you'll see that says the tile has been triggered. And again, you'll notice that the click is the only action we have here. So manual activation does not have to be specified in order for that to work. There are some situations where you would definitely want to have manually activate specified, but that's going to be based upon using some other actions that we aren't going to cover in this particular video where we're going over basics. Those are kind of the main and principal ways that you're going to be activating amongst active tile triggers. The vast majority of tile setups that you're going to have are going to use one of these either movement events or a click event or manual activation. There are, again, a ton of different options here, though. So if you want to have some more specific or niche applications, those are available to you as well. Things like door triggers, lighting changes, or combat turns and rounds happening. All of those are documented pretty thoroughly on the wiki, and we do cover some of them in some of our other tutorials, but I highly recommend that you check out the wiki if you want to learn more about these individually, or let us know in the comments if you want a separate video discussing some of these in more detail. And with that, that's going to be the basics of the setup section for Monk's Active Tile Triggers. Now that we've gone over our setup and our triggers, let's take a look at actions. When it comes to actions, there's a few different things to know. If you hit add, this is how you can create a new action. And all actions have some commonalities. We're not going to go through every single action because, as you'll see in a moment, there are a lot. However, we'll go over some common pieces that are present between either all actions or most actions. So first off, we have the action drop-down menu, and this is going to show you every single action that we have. There's a ton, but don't be intimidated. There's only a few that we use really regularly, and the rest are kind of more niche applications. And if you want to learn more about any individual action, then if you go on the wiki, there is a page for every single action with what all of the settings are, what they mean, and what they do. And we also have a variety of tutorials on Automating Foundry that use a lot of these. Today we're going to use some common ones as part of our examples for how actions work, but we're not going to really drill down into specific actions too much. So when it comes to your actions in the dropdown, you can scroll through and select them. You can also begin typing out the action that you want. For example, I'm going to look for a chat message. So as I type chat message, it's going to scroll down there. I can also search for send notification, and we'll go there as well. An important thing to note with this typing to auto scroll feature is that you have to start from the very beginning of the action. This means I can't start typing notification to get here if I'm on, say, ping or something like that. I have to start with send. If you have some additional modules, for example, tagger, then that will also add some extra actions. FX Master, Defred's convenient effects if you're on 5e, and Monk's token bar also add additional actions. Again, the wiki has a full list of additional actions provided by different modules. As we mentioned, all actions are going to have the action dropdown that specifies what action it is, and then we're going to have a few other really common fields. The first is going to be something like select entity. So for activate, deactivate, we have a few options, and let's see if we can find a more expansive one. So here we have alter. Alter is where we're changing values of some kind of attribute associated with an entity. An entity in this case is going to be anything on the canvas. It can be a tile, a token, a light, sound, wall, drawing, whatever. But that is an entity generally speaking. Not all actions can affect all entities, but that's going to get you in the right ballpark. When it comes to selecting an entity, we have a few different options. The most common one is going to be the crosshairs here, which just select. So if we hit the select option, it's going to minimize all of our tile configuration, and we can go around and we can click on what we want to alter. And it's always going to have the type of entity and a colon and then the ID by default. If you have specified the name in the configuration or you have used tagger to apply tags to it, then it would display that instead of the ID here. You can also double click on these and then you can see the full bit. And you can see that it has the scene and then the tile here. So it is specific to this scene and this tile in order to actually reference it. In addition to the select entity, we also have things like use this tile. Basically anything that can affect a tile can affect the current tile. This is a much easier way of just hitting this tile rather than having to select it. Then we have the triggering token. As we mentioned before, a trigger is whatever sets off this chain of actions. So the token that satisfies the event parameters here, whether that's entering or exiting or clicking on something, then that is what is going to be the triggering token to start here. Then we have entities within the triggering tile. And most of the time that's going to end up being tokens within tile. But on some features, you can change it to lights or sounds. Then we have use player tokens, which is going to, as the name might suggest, affect all player tokens, but it's only going to affect the player tokens on that particular scene. It's not going to affect player tokens on other scenes. Depending upon what you're changing, though, of course, because player tokens are generally linked, then it can affect all of the tokens. It just depends on what exactly you're doing. Then we have the actions current collection. This allows you to select from a variety of pieces in the collection. The collection is essentially all of the entities of that particular data type that have been picked up by the tile. You can get really in the weeds about these things, but to keep it simple, the tokens in your current collection, or the current tokens, are going to be all of the tokens the tile currently knows about. It learns about tokens by either them triggering the tile or by having some kind of filter action to pick up those tokens. So it always knows the triggering token to start. The triggering token is a current token when the event actually occurs. If you want to change or add additional tokens into that collection, you can do that by using things like filters. And you can use this to find tokens within a distance, or by items in their inventory or conditions applied to them, or also by using tagger to find them as well. But that is a really basic overview of what the current whatever is. In general, it's going to be things that you have found by using these filter actions. If you want to learn more about them, then there's a lot of great sample tiles. And we also cover this a little bit more in our handy Monk's Active Tile Triggers reference video. And any of our tutorials in our Automating Foundry series that discuss the differences between current and triggering pieces and its relevance to the actions that we're using there, we go in more detail there. But to keep it simple, current tokens, just whatever you have found so far. Then finally, we have tagger. And tagger is a really common preferred method here. The reason being is that, as we recall with the select entity, that included the scene ID. So if we copy and paste this tile to another scene and keep these actions, it's going to still be referencing a tile on this other scene, or it's not going to be able to find that particular tile anymore. So it's really nice to be able to use tagger because then we're not stuck with just that specific version. We can now pack things away into a compendium, or we can reference a broader variety of things instead of just having to pick one thing at a time. So for example, we're going to use this test light tag, which I've applied to a light on the scene. Then we have the match section. Match is going to default to every term, which means every single tag term that you put up here needs to be on whatever entity you're looking for. So here I only have the one, but if I added something like test2 or something like that, then this is only going to affect entities that have both of these tags. But they could also have additional tags. For example, if something had example on it or test3, it would still be affected because it has test light and test2 on it. If we were to switch this to any term, Then if we had still say test 2, as long as something had either test light or test 2 and any number of other tags on it, then it would be affected. Then finally, we have exactly those terms, which will look for the 2 tags of test light and test 2 and only apply to things that have those tags and those tags exactly. They cannot have any additional tags. In general, when using tagger, we recommend you stick to either every term or any term if you're trying to affect something that has a variety of tags. Then finally, we have the scene section, and that's where tagger is going to go looking for things. Active scene is somewhat of a misnomer, and it's really referring to the current scene or the scene that the tile is on, rather than the active scene. You do not actually have to have the scene physically activated for the tile to look there. You can also select all scenes, and then it's going to affect everything with that tag on all scenes. This is particularly useful for setting up things like teleports, so that you can jump to different scenes without having to specify an exact scene, and you can use those tags. Then you can specify individual scenes. And it's important to note with these scenes that although it's displaying you the name, it is looking for it by ID. So if you pack something up and put it into a compendium and you don't preserve that scene ID, either when you pack it away or when you pull it back out, then it's no longer going to go to that proper scene or look on that proper scene. So for that reason, we typically stick with either active scene or all scenes, depending upon what we're doing. In this case, I don't need to do anything on another scene. Right here is good for me. So we have the active scene set up there for our tagger. And that's kind of the gist of the entity selection here. Then most actions are going to have additional settings, such as the attribute and value here for alter. Alter is a somewhat more complex action here, as we can affect all kinds of things, but one of the things you could do is you could change the elevation to 10, for instance. And if we go ahead and update this, and I will activate our light that has the test light tag on it, so I've applied that with tagger. For tagger, as we saw earlier, tagger added this field to the bottom of our tile. It also adds it to the bottom of every entity editing page. You simply type in any tags that you want, and then you can hit enter to complete it, or add tags to also add it in. I highly recommend you either hit enter or hit add tags before updating. Sometimes it doesn't seem to automatically register and save the tags when you hit update if you do not make sure it gets added here in one of these little tags. Now that this is there, I'm going to go ahead and trigger this tile. And when we open up our lights, we can see this has been increased by 10 feet. So that's a really basic overview of what elevation can do. There's a whole lot of options for alter that allows you to change a variety of things such as tile tinting or the colors on a light, etc. But that is a really basic overview. Importantly with actions, you'll notice that when we use this add, it adds the action down at the bottom. This matters a lot because with Monk's active tile triggers, once you have passed all of your needed information for your event or your trigger to happen, when we go to actions, we're going to start at the top and work our way down. So here, if we have anything that needs to happen first, we want to have that higher up. In this case, it's not a big deal, but if we wanted something to be in a different spot, then we would move it around. So in this case, I'll go ahead and add a delay to further emphasize this. So with this delay, I'm going to actually swap out our alter for something else. Now you can edit and change from the dropdown to pick a different action. Generally speaking, you probably want to delete and add a new action instead, just so that way your data gets kept clean. But in this case, it's not too big of an issue. So I have test light and I'm going to toggle its activation. Activate deactivate is a pretty common action that you may want to use. It will turn off a tile, so make it in that inactive state that can't be activated anymore. Or it will also turn on or off a sound or light. So that is where that is really helpful, and we'll have that in place. And so now that we have this wait in place, when we activate this, the light should switch, and then after a couple seconds, the dialog should appear. And so now we have our dialog. And so that matters top to bottom. And we can see if we reverse these, that the inverse is also true here. So our dialog went off, and after a couple seconds, our light has turned on. So the order matters for your actions. This isn't as critical with pretty simple tiles, but again, anytime you need to add a delay or you need to wait on things because things are going to be looking at each other and you want to make sure that they're being kept straight and organized, then keep in mind that you have to have that order. In a similar vein, if you want to add in an action and its location matters to you, of course you can do the drag and drop, but as you saw earlier, it could maybe be a little tedious to reorder everything like that. Rather than adding something and then dragging it around, we can right click and either insert above or insert below in order to add new layers or new actions to the workflow in an appropriate place. You'll also notice that we have the duplicate option, and that will populate there as well. Another great thing about the actions is that if you want to create a similar tile or you want to reuse an action on another tile, simply open up the destination tile here. You do need to make sure that you have at least an action over here first, but then you can click and drag any action from a tile's action section to another tile's action section. So this is a great way to copy over specific lines or actions that maybe have a detailed amount of setup that you don't want to have to replicate by hand every time. This way you can know for sure that they are identical. You'll of course need to update that tile to save all of that information. We have all of that there. Similarly, if you have a tile that's already good to go, or you might just need to change a couple things, if you copy and paste a tile, it maintains all of the same data, so it has all of these exact triggers and everything. With the ordering taken care of, let's go ahead and take a quick look at show dialog. Again, we're not going to dive into all of the nitty-gritty about dialog, but there are some other pieces here to examine. So here we have the for section, and this is going to be who gets this dialog that we've had popping up. And this is a similar vein to our select entity, but it's going to have some different parameters. Our select entity is usually going to be things that are on the canvas, whereas this is going to be people just interacting with the game. And here we have triggering player, and the triggering player is whoever actually triggered the tile. If you recall from our setup and our history, we have the game master for the who. That's going to be that triggering player with each of these events and triggers that occurred. So the triggering player is whoever actually did the triggering. Then we, of course, have some pretty obvious ones of everyone. So everybody who's logged in is going to get this dialogue. Then we have players only, which is only players, and then GMs only, which is, of course, GMs. Then we get into slightly more interesting ones with the triggering token owner and the rest of the bunch here. So the triggering token is, again, the token that actually caused the triggering of that tile. And as we saw in our early example, Ventress was our triggering token, right? Ventress has all players set as owners. And since all players are owners of Ventress, then that means instead of just the player who was controlling Ventress at the time that he triggered the tile getting the message, every single person who owns Ventress is going to get the pop-up. So if 3 players own Ventress, 3 players will get the pop-up when one of them moves Ventress into the tile and triggers it. So this can be useful if you have important information for all of the owners of a particular token, or if, say, it's like a party NPC or something like that, that multiple people have ownership of, they'll all get that information. Current tokens is very similar. Again, your triggering token is your first current token until you make changes to it. So for the most part, it's going to be your triggering token plus or minus any kind of filters that you put on there. And then finally, we have current users, which is going to be like the current token versus triggering token. Your triggering player is going to start as your current user. And then whenever you add filters in there, then you can add or remove users to that current list. But it starts with your triggering player. And so those are the basic parameters here for these different actions. Now that we've kind of gone over the basics of actions, let's discuss images. And we'll discuss this particular action for switching the tile image in a moment. The Images tab is only used by Monk's active tile triggers, or a macro if you have one set up. So here we can add additional images. So typically speaking, you want to add the actual original image first. And when we update the tile, this should now display 1. There is 1 image here, and then we can add additional ones. This begins counting from 1 rather than counting from 0 like some other pieces might. And then we can add additional images. And now I have the action for switch tile image, and I have it specified to this tile, and I'm changing it to next. Change to has a variety of options here. You can have first, last, next, previous, random, or a specific image. So you could make it 1 or 2, etc. You can also make transitions, which can be pretty fun depending upon what you are doing. And you can determine how you're going to layer it, etc. I have everything saved. I'll go ahead and activate this. You can see we're bumping it over. You'll note that I have this tile tinted so it's nice and visible on this white background, but when you're doing these transitions, it will lose the tint for it. So in addition to having these individual entries, we can also use entire folders of images. So if I select, say, this levers folder and select the directory, it's going to add every single lever that is inside of that folder, which is kind of a lot. But we can take a look at it as an example. You'll notice that some of these look really big and some of them look really small. And that's because this tile does not resize its area that takes up on the canvas when you change the image. So it's important to keep in mind if you're doing anything with a really different aspect ratio in the source image from what you're starting with. Also useful if they are really different sizes, then it will necessarily expand their dimensions and make them fill out. So you can make certain things look less high quality if they are a lower resolution image than what you started with. Another cool application here is that we can also use wildcards. So here I have the 1x1 for a lot of these. A lot of these have 1x1, right? So I can take the end of this, and if you're familiar with the wildcard system and the rest of Foundry's file naming convention, if we add an asterisk and then select the file and update, now, whenever we activate this tile, it's going to go to a random 1x1 tile that is within that particular folder. You can use this for a variety of different pieces, but it's really handy when you have a wide array of objects with the similar name. So again, it's going to be the same file path, so you just pick one to start with, and then you add an asterisk where you want things to change. So all of these pieces are active -tile -1x1, and then usually have something else after it. If you just put that asterisk in there, then it's going to randomly pick from any of these. Or in this case, it's going to be just next down the line. Again, the Images tab isn't used by anything except for Monk's active tile triggers itself. So if you don't intend on switching the images around for a given tile using Monk's active tile triggers, then you don't need to worry about this at all. And that covers the basics of what you need to know about Monk's active tile triggers and setting them up. Now we know we didn't cover everything there is to know about Monk's active tile triggers, and we didn't get into actions in depth. So we want to leave you with some extra resources and also invite you to tell us in the comments if you would like us to have some dedicated videos going over just the basics of specific actions or action types. And then we can create follow-ups that drill down the actions specifically as maybe a expanded part of the course or a Monk's Active Tile Triggers 102 type of session. As far as resources go, there's of course the playlist that you're already on right now, and that's our Automating Foundry playlist here on YouTube. We have a ton of different great examples on different tile setups and some different concepts, such as using dialogues to create menus for yourself or using landings to really supercharge what an individual tile can do for you. There is also the amazing Monk's Active Tile Triggers wiki, which has a lot of articles for all of the topics we discussed today and individual pages for every single action in the Monk's Active Tile Triggers library. It'll tell you everything they do and how to set them up, etc. There's also a handy set of reference sample tiles that you can look through and reverse engineer to take apart as you need, or just use them right out of the box for your maps. It's a really great resource, and it's one that we use heavily. Finally, we also have some really great resources directly at Bailiwiki. In addition to our Automating Foundry playlist on YouTube, you can also join our Discord, where there's a ton of helpful folks willing to chime in about Monk's Active Tile Trigger setups, etc. We also offer our Foundry Mastery Program, which includes things like an exclusive Discord channel for direct feedback and question answering, as well as options for one-on-one coaching hours where I sit down with you and we go through whatever topics you want to learn about Foundry VTT. One of our recent coaching sessions actually inspired me to make this video and really provide a good understanding of the basics in video format for folks. But our topics are absolutely not limited to just Monk's Active Tau triggers. I'm happy to sit down and discuss any and everything Foundry VTT related with you. You can find links to all of these resources in the description down below. And that's going to conclude our video on MATT 101. We hope that this video has simplified some of the basics and helped you get a better understanding of what you need to know and what you need to do to have some success with Monk's Active Tau triggers. But of course, let us know in the comments if you'd like me to cover some additional basics here or expand upon general ideas rather than some of the more specific tile setups that we've gone over in other Automating Foundry videos. If you like this content, then subscribe to keep up with all of our latest videos and hit the bell to never miss an upload when we put them out, and consider becoming a patron. Not only do you support the channel, but you also gain access to all the modular systems and scenes that we've made, and you can also enroll in our mastery program to get some one-on-one coaching with me if that interests you. Again, this has been Zephyr with the Bailey Wiki channel. Thank you so much for watching, happy gaming, and have a good one.